Welcome back to Invest Global. Today marks the start of a one-week negotiation between the US and Russia, focusing on the tensions that have been built up in Crimea, right on the Ukraine and Russia border. Throughout this video, I'll be breaking down some of the macro conversation here, really focusing on some of the supply chain issues we've been seeing. We see this going viral, which is pretty insane, which is bare shelves Biden. So all across America, we're seeing massive supply shortages. I don't think it's necessarily good or thoughtful way to approach it by just blaming Biden. I don't think that's a good way of thinking about this at all, but I think it's very, very important to pay attention to what's going on here, not just in the US, but we see the energy crisis in Europe as well. Also, I'll be tying this in with some of the investment narrative we have with Russia. I am actually bullish on Russia as a whole for long-term investing. Some people may be shocked by that. I think there's a great conversation that you should highly check out between Ladislas Maurice, Sven Lawrence, and Lyle Taylor. He hosted it on the Wandering Investor channel. I'll definitely link that down below in the description. They do a great job of breaking down, the thesis and kind of narrative around Russia and why most people would, basically reject the thought, especially in the US, of investing in Russia. But it's a very, very interesting conversation, so highly recommend watching this. But I'll be breaking all those things down. Also, it's very important to understand, Gazprom actually supplies around 2/3 of the EU's gas supply. The largest country that really has a giant demand for gas is Germany in that case. And then also, it's the largest gas company in the world. Russia as a whole is a massive oil producer and is very, very important to understand in the commodity space if you're trying to understand what's going on here. But let's kick off the video. So, prospects dim as the US and Russia prepare to meet over Ukraine. Now, I'll be going through a bunch of different articles and kind of breaking down all these things and kind of summarizing them in an easy to understand way. It's very important to diversify where you're getting your information. I like to just ideally find the objective analysis of what's going on versus just someone's opinion. So yes, I will skip through a lot of these articles. I'm not going to read through the full thing. I'm going to focus on getting the facts out and then kind of a little bit of analysis. Obviously, it's just my opinion on things. Make your own decisions. I always like to think of things kind of from a scientific perspective and first principles, if possible, and kind of remove emotion and just look at things clearly. So one of the important things that I think is interesting here is the two threats, right? So what are the two narratives going on? Well, the U.S. and most Western countries are concerned over Russia kind of amassing all these troops in Ukraine because Ukraine and other Eastern European countries like Georgia kind of in this gray area, right? So if we're looking at NATO versus the CSTO, these two kind of treaty organizations, there's actually a great site right here that I'll show you. So CSTO has these given countries. So Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, which that's why Russia was able to come in and kind of help Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, obviously, and Tajikistan. And then other states that actually observe this is Afghanistan and Serbia. Now, when we're looking at the NATO, right, which is it's like National Atlantic Treaty Organization, if I remember correctly. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. Right here, we can see it's basically all of the EU, Canada, and the US, right? So way more countries that are involved here. But when we're looking at, Georgia and Ukraine, they're kind of in this weird gray area where, who defends them? But the US in this case has basically threatened, hey, if Russia invades, we're going to step in. And Russia's saying, hey, we're concerned over the US's kind of continual move into Eastern Europe and closer towards Russia. Now, there's kind of two playing cards here before things get violent. And in my opinion, that's Russia, which has all these commodity reserves, all this kind of power that we obviously can see with Gazprom, which again is owned by the actual Russian government. It's not a private company. So you can't invest in this, by the way, if you're a U.S. citizen. But if you're looking at, what are the playing cards here? What are kind of the two things that could happen? Well, if Russia kind of invades, this is by the way, a very, very basic understanding of what's going on here. If Russia invades, the U.S. has basically said, hey, we're going to increase sanctions, right? So there already are some sanctions around Russia, but we're going to increase these things, potentially kick you out of SWIFT, which that's a whole nother conversation. They actually, in that interview, talk about that in this Ladislas's with Sven Lawrence. It's really, really interesting, their thoughts on it. And really what they talk about is, hey, if the U.S. is threatening this, by the way, SWIFT is kind of this international banking, how international banking works, right? So all banks around the world basically report via the SWIFT system. But if the U.S. kicks Russia out of SWIFT, well, Russia has a lot of cards to play. Russia has a lot of kind of bartering options here, and it's quite concerning, right? So it'd be like, if the U.S. kicks Russia out, would maybe China come in and Russia and China team up, and maybe some of the Middle East there gets involved? It's going to be interesting to see how that all plays out. But these are kind of things multiple steps deep, right? So if A happens, then what are the probable scenarios? You have to think of best case and worst case scenario. Yes, clearly this could end up in war. Obviously don't want that to happen, but it's very important to kind of understand all these factors at play. So they also said that Russia could be hit hard with economic sanctions should it intervene in Ukraine, in addition to direct sanctions on Russian equities. Those penalties could include significant restrictions on products exported from the U.S. to Russia, and potentially foreign-made projects subject to U.S. jurisdiction. Now, this next article breaks down some of the things that were talked about in today's meeting. Again, this is the first of many meetings throughout this week. Putin and Biden have met before. None of these conversations, to be quite honest, it doesn't have a ton of substance. It was kind of just for the pictures. If I'm just going to be completely honest about it, I've done a lot of research into this, and yes, there is a lot of saving face. There is a lot of shaking hands with the flags and stuff. But at the end of the day, materially, what actually happened? Not a lot, to be quite honest. Hopefully things do develop. Hopefully, we kind of come out with the most peaceful scenario here. But it's very important to understand, what Vladimir Putin said about this. So he described NATO's expansion to Ukraine and other former Soviet states as a red line for Moscow, demanding binding guarantees from the West that they shouldn't become members of the alliance. So a red line. That's very important to understand. I think if that Kazakhstan crisis would have gotten worse, now things have kind of calmed down a little bit, but if it would have gotten worse, the U.S. most likely would have stepped in. And it's very important to understand there, well, if there's continual crisis here, and this is actually an incredibly important country, Kazakhstan, massive country, biggest supply of uranium in the world. I've talked about that in my previous video. And if you're curious on learning more about the Kazakhstan kind of crisis, I break it down in this video. I'll have this link down below in the description. I made that 2 days ago or something like that. But it's very important to watch what's happening in Kazakhstan with Bitcoin and uranium, and I discuss it in that video. So at the end of the day, when we're looking at this, if things get worse in Kazakhstan, if things get worse in Crimea, most likely NATO is going to step in. And at the end of the day, this is where we have to look at, okay, what is going to be, if we look at, okay, conflict versus just economic threats, how are these two things going to play out? And I previously described kind of my idea around some of those economic threats. Again, this is a very basic overview. It's not at all a deep dive video. This is kind of a summary, so it's easy to understand. If you want a super detailed video, I'd be happy to make that, but it would probably be multiple hours. But again, this video is just so you can kind of hopefully understand these things in a little bit easier to understand way. So if we move on here, Ukraine crisis between Russia and the West in the region has been brewing for 30 years. This breaks down the overall kind of conflict, why Crimea is this very important place, in a very interesting way. I think they do a really good job with this. I'll have this link down below in the description as well. It's from the conversation. So they talk about, 3 decades ago on December 8th, 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved, and Russia, Ukraine, Belarus set Commonwealth of Independent States, similar to other like Georgia and Armenia, some of these other ones that kind of broke off the Soviet Union. Now, 30 years on, the three countries are locked in a dangerous troika of, I don't know if I said that right, of confrontation and a brinksmanship that threatens to plunge the region into further conflict. So, post-Soviet political history of Belarus and Ukraine is interesting on many levels. The former turned into Europe's only dictatorship, heavily dependent on Russia for its survival. The latter, meanwhile, is transitional democracy, which has facilitated between Russia and Western influences over the years. This, in and of itself, led to tensions which boiled over in 2014, when pro-EU protesters in Ukraine led the collapse of the pro-Russian government, Russia's annexation of Crimea, and the conflict with separatists in eastern Ukraine. So I'm not going to continue on with this. You can read the rest of the article, but I think it's very important to understand is Ukraine is not going to invade Russia. So this is, in my opinion, this whole Crimea thing is pretty one-sided. Yes, there definitely will be radicals in eastern Ukraine, don't get me wrong there, but the overall government of Ukraine, they're not going to invade Russia. It's only coming from Russia, and I think that's kind of important to understand. Again, that is a generalization. Yes, most things are a generalization, but at the end of the day, that dynamic is very important to understand, and why is Russia having so many more troops versus Ukraine there, and potentially, will this turn into like a North Korea, South Korea border thing? I think it could be interesting to potentially play out. Hopefully this doesn't escalate. Now moving on, so the internet returns to Almaty following a 5-day outage here in Kazakhstan. This is what caused that massive drop in the Bitcoin hash rates. Kazakhstan supplies, I think it's like over 12% or something like that of the Bitcoin hash rates. Again, I talked about it in that video. So they talked about, that they've been offline since Wednesday amid the wave of violence in the country. Almost 8,000 people have been detained throughout the country, the interior of the ministry said on Monday. Obviously, I discussed in that video how, these kind of rioters are really just citizens of the country who are kind of ticked off of this continual kind of just terrible decision-making by the government. They've made all these promises. They never really keep the promises. Also, this kind of massive rise in gas prices, where it's definitely cause as well. So these different catalysts, obviously you have tensions because of COVID, and things aren't looking the best there, to be quite honest. So they do say that they have, retained this power. They've kind of come back, but they talk about, the basics here. So why does Kazakhstan matter? A former Soviet republic, which is mainly Muslim with a large Russian minority. It has the vast mineral resources with 3% of global oil reserves in important coal and gas sectors. So they talk about, why is this in the news? Fuel riots, which have escalated to become broader protests against the governments, have resulted in resignations at the top of the bloody crackdown and protesters. So moving on here, they talk about, why Russia sent troops into into Kazakhstan rather. Basically, the thing to understand here is Kazakhstan, they asked for it. I'm going to break this down very, very easy to understand. They talk about this in much more detail in this article. You can look it up if you would like. This is from Foreign Policy, why Russia sent troops to Ukraine, but I will move on from there. I kind of discussed this, NATO versus the CSTO. I'll return to this, though, just a little bit of the history here to understand. So the National Atlantic Treaty Organization versus the CSTO. Obviously, the National Atlantic Treaty Organization was created, I think, much before the CSTO. So this was initially established on May 15th of 1992 through the Collective Security Treaties and the Tashkent Pact, or the Tashkent Treaty. The latest version of the CSTO was founded on October 7th of 2002 after some of the member states, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Uzbekistan, pulled themselves out of the military alliance. The CSTO is now headquartered in Moscow, Russia. So very important to understand this. It's very centralized, to be quite honest. I mean, out of all of these, Russia, I would say, is like 80% of this, right? So when we're looking at the CSTO, that's just the fact of the matter. Moving on here, so just again, just kind of a visual overview. So we're looking at a majority of the NATO is in this area, right? So we're looking here. Africa is not really a part of this. These Baltic states are obviously parts. And then we're looking at Canada and the U.S. versus we're looking at the CSTO, where we have Georgia's not a part of it, but we have, let's see, so Afghanistan obviously observes it. Serbia, a country that I absolutely love. By the way, I love Georgia, love Ukraine, all these countries. I've spent the past year traveling through pretty much all these areas. So Serbia right here, they observe it as well. Then we have, let's see, so Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and then Russia, obviously. So we move on from here. Now I'm going to talk about this kind of whole bear shelves Biden. Again, it's not Biden's fault. I'm not pro or against Biden. I'm not pro or anti-Trump. Just remove the politics. Objectively, this is about the supply chain, right? So it's not like Biden is stocking the shelves in these places. I think it's very, very important to understand that. Yes, people like to use these things as kind of like a political playing card, but at the end of the day, I'll just scroll through some of these. You can see I don't know. It's kind of weird when it becomes this emotional thing. Again, I think objectively, obviously, this is concerning. It's just like Europe's energy crisis. We're seeing this. I think this is just the beginning. I'm probably going to be talking about, this interesting conversation that Joe Rogan had with Adam Curry on food technology, how China has kind of been really stockpiling these whole maize and rice, basically two of the same things, but maize and rice stocks, right? So they've been just stockpiling this, and it is quite concerning what we're seeing here in the U.S. Obviously, some of these pictures, you don't know exactly what to trust, but I mean, overall, I saw this when I was back in the U.S., and I think it's quite concerning. There are a lot of these things going on. I think these pictures kind of just show exactly what's happening. This is the importance of obviously having a plan B, having a second passport, a second residency, and I think it's very, very important to diversify not just economically but politically. Then also, hey, if you're going to stay in the U.S., have stockpiles. Do have these things. It's not like prepper or whatever. Be completely objective and go, okay, the supply chain is not a secure thing necessarily. Things can happen. It's not like these things are promised, right? Especially look at places like New York. New York is very concerning. So we'll end it out here with Gazprom. I think this, as far as an investment narrative in Russia, is quite compelling. Let's talk about this again. They discuss this in much greater detail. I highly respect these guys. Ladislas Maurice has this great YouTube channel, The Wandering Investor. Sven Lawrence and Lyle Taylor, they do a really, really good job of breaking down this topic. But Gazprom here, so about 12.7 billion cubic feet of gas flowed from Europe into Europe from Russia's state-owned Gazprom last month. The world's largest gas producer typically supplies more than a third of the needs across the European Union. But in November, flows dwindled to a 6-year low. So the gas supplies from Russia have fallen well short of the pre-pandemic levels. The volumes of Russian gas flowing into homes, businesses, and storage facilities this year have almost quarter those below in 2019. So this is quite compelling, right? Again, this is a chip that Russia has. You can't deny that, right? So if they're being threatened to like be out of SWIFT, well, Russia has a great part in that, right? So the EU has a great part in that. Obviously, Russia would have the effect of it, but at the end of the day, Russia has a lot of these kind of playing cards that they can pull out, right? And it's very important to understand this when you have these tight supply shocks. Well, you can only say so much. You can only do so much politically. Where it's like at the end of the day, they need gas. It's not like the U.S. is going to start shipping gas, or maybe Africa. They have a high dependency on Russia, and that would affect the entire EU. So keep these things in mind. Gazprom, I think they did a great job breaking it down in that video, but I also like this. So this does a really good job of kind of breaking down, talking about how Europe is one of the regions that is most dependent on gas, used to the supply of the fifth of this energy, but most of its supply comes from the outside of the EU, in particular from Russia. President Vladimir Putin has been accused by some of the European politicians and industry analysts of limiting the supply and storage of gas to Europe in the recent months as a means to pressure the continent into approving the new pipeline. So again, this is one of those. I'm drawing a blank on the word. I keep saying playing cards, but it's like a bartering chip, if you know what I mean. You probably let me know in the comments if you know what I'm trying to say. A bartering chip is essentially what it is. The Russian president says the allegation is politically motivated blather, but most analysts believe low supplies from Russia are a major factor. Europe is also being squeezed by changes to the gas market and competition from the further regions that left the continent praying for a mild winter. So Russia dominates the landscape. They talk about this. They basically go through Ukraine and all these other things, but I won't bore you guys too much here. It is interesting, kind of these different pipelines. Maybe I'll do a deep dive video on this, but this video is getting relatively long. I do want to hopefully get it up today. Yeah, that's basically all for this video. This is also a great article on it. But if you guys have any questions, any comments, let me know down below in the comment section. If you enjoyed this video, if you kind of like when I talk about geopolitics, things outside of the blockchain markets, I do think blockchain fixes a lot of these problems. That's why I talk a lot about blockchain. But at the end of the day, these things are very, very important to understand. I might make a follow-up maybe at the end of the week on this kind of U.S.-Russia negotiations. But that's all for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, again, let me know in the comments down below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel to stay up to date, hit the notification bell, and click all. There's also a Telegram group down below in the description, our must-watch videos. Twitter is at investglobal_IO. You can see that right here. And again, go watch this video. Such a great conversation, three brilliant minds. That's all for this one. Invest Global, and until next time.